Welcome to episode 2 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the novel The Fall by Albert Camus. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where great books and great ideas are what we like to prescribe. I'm Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Albert Camus' iconic philosophical novella, The Fall, which was famously described by his contemporary Jean-Paul Sartre as perhaps the most beautiful and least understood of Camus' works. Camus was, of course, a renowned French intellectual, author, and journalist, often associated with the existentialist movement, although he consistently disavowed that label. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature at the age of 44 for iconic works such as The Stranger, The Rebel, and The Myth of Sisyphus, and he tragically died in a car crash just a few years after receiving that award. The Fall recounts the story of a former Parisian lawyer, Clemence, now in self-imposed exile in Amsterdam, who has undergone a moral crisis in his life. A series of revelatory events that he recounts have left him utterly cynical and bent upon exposing the egotism and sham inhumanity, which he feels that most people live in utter denial of. At the start of the novel, he latches onto a fellow Parisian he meets in a seedy bar, and then he subjects his unnamed companion to a cunningly contrived confession, which we later find out is intended to open the unnamed man's eyes to his own baseness and hypocrisy. What his companion, and of course the reader too, has actually undergone is in fact Clemence's radical solution to his own predicament, where he has become the self-appointed judge penitent of his fellow creatures. Hi there, Alex.
Hi,
so
Steve.
how did you enjoy revisiting The Fall then?
Well, I'm glad to say I didn't find it quite as unnerving as I did when I first read it, 15, 20 years ago. Probably because at that time it chimed more with my, belated cynicism that you're meant to have in your teenage years, but I seemed to kick in my early 20s. And so Clemence's perspective resonated more at that time. I think reading it now, I still found it remarkably eloquent. Of course, the character is meant to be. It's part of his seductive appeal.
Sure.
And there are some good insights about human nature in it. But I still found it, or I did find it this time, a more constructed story, more contrived in some ways. And I'm not saying necessarily that's how Camus expected us to feel at the conclusion of this novel, for us to doubt Clemence's account in some ways. But that was more a prominent feature for me this time.
Okay. Yeah.
How was it for you then?
Yeah, it's interesting that it's obviously not a feel-good novel, although you can, as you described it is a beautifully written novel. So yeah, that was something that second time around I could appreciate. And as you say, the construction of it, it is quite an ambiguous novel. I think I think it's meant to leave you a little bit uncertain about quite what Camus intended, maybe how much of himself was coming through in this character and so on. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting novel, but yeah, I'm not sure that, like yourself, the sentiments of it possibly didn't resonate as much as they might have done at a younger age. We don't want to sound too dismissive there, saying that it's only a novel for adolescents or anything. It's not that, but for some reason we've shifted our perspective. Maybe as Harold Wilson would say, we've immatured with age. We don't know. Maybe we were more profound when we were younger reading it. I don't know. But this discussion will help us sort it out, I think, too. I think so, yeah. It's not, for me, it's not so much a kind of, in any way, dissing the quality of the novel. I mean, it is a beautiful novel. But yeah, I think in terms of just how much it speaks to you, I think it's interesting that maybe at different points in life, it could be a novel that has more or less resonance. As you say, maybe in another 20 years, we'll be like Clemence's herself, perhaps by that point. I don't know.
Yes, I'll be hanging around the pubs of Dundee trying to do what he did. I think he chose a more apt venue for it, to be honest, than pubs in Dundee. I just don't think that they would listen long enough without having a drink by their side.
I think that's a good point. You might be struggling to get that person to come back again for the second night.
I think
to hear
so, and I just
monologue.
don't think they'll buy it so much, that perspective. There, Clemence was more eloquent, and where he was more suited, I think, to that introspection.
I would agree with you there. I think so. So I mean, so in terms of just getting down to the nitty gritty of this novel, so a couple of things I want to say about it, and then a question for you. So obviously the novel is in the form of a series of confessional monologues by this protagonist who we've mentioned, who calls himself John Baptiste Clemence, although we find out actually that's not his real name. He confesses to that as it goes on, but he seems to be a former Parisian lawyer who's now in this self-imposed exile in Amsterdam, and during these monologues where he has met this unnamed interlocutor at a bar in the red light district, he tells this story of his life and his fall. So as the title of the novel suggests. So my first question, really, Alex, that I thought we could explore was what do you see as the nature of this fall that Clemence has undergone?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the key question. If we can't sort that out, then we're not going to really understand the novel as a whole. So I think, but I was thinking maybe the best way for us to talk about it, and it might make more sense for our listeners, is to break it down into three key questions here, if we take the fall as a kind of metaphor or a motif here. And so the first part would be, well, what was the nature of his original elevated position? What way, because a fall is from a greater height to a lesser height. So what was the nature of this original elevated position? I think that's the first key question regarding his fall. The second thing would be, well, what is the nature of this transition from higher to lower? It's almost like an inversion. So what does that involve? And then the third part, which is maybe a little less obvious, is that, when we have a fall, it's usually an injury of some kind, or it can be. And so what kind of injury did Clemence suffer, and how does he recuperate, so to speak? So I think probably if we cover those three dimensions, we'll probably cover quite a bit about what is the nature of the fall. So yeah, I mean, sorry to be long-winded about that, but to go back to, I suppose, the first sub-question, to put it that way, would be, what is the nature of the elevated position that he has? And so we find at the start of this story, when he recounts how he was, in this Edenic-like state, that you can see he had this inflated, egotism, this sense that there was a simplicity to his life. He never questioned his goodness, because it seems almost as though he was entirely identified with goodness. I think there's a part of the novel where he said he was like justice itself. So, his moral credentials were never in question. He was, as he says later, it was this profound self-satisfaction that he had. So this elevated position is kind of intimating his ego, that it was inflated, that he almost had this godlike relationship with virtue. He even says at one point he was like a god lowered into the courtroom to speak and to pronounce what was good and what was just. So there was this, tremendous certainty, and with that tremendous certainty, a certain simplicity to his life, to his being. He then comes to question that. We could get on to that in a minute, but that's what I would say would be the nature of that elevated position that he had.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a nice quote actually I've got from the novel here where Clement says, "For a long time I lived in the illusion of a general agreement, whereas from all sides judgment, arrows, mockeries rained on me, inattentive and smiling. The day I was alerted, I became lucid. I received all my wounds at the same time and lost my strength all at once. The whole universe then began to laugh at me." And it's like this incident, which, of course, the famous point in the story where he hears a woman has jumped into the River Seine, and he freezes, he doesn't act, he thinks about it'll be cold in the river, and then he hears her drowning, and he does nothing, and then he goes home. This obviously was this bombshell for him, where his, as you described, almost godlike self-assurance, where he just felt he was this model of goodness because he was perceived socially to be such a great man. This was completely shattered by this moment, I guess, when he came to understand what it said about him.
Yes, I mean it's his social standing, or what he thinks is his social standing, and his own perception of himself. It's this illusory stature, this false height that he has. A false height with no real depth, and that is his original elevated, position. A godlike security in his own virtue. As a little side note, it does seem a bit difficult to believe that somebody as eloquent and as introspective as Clemens was ever quite as at one with himself as that, but that's what we're led to believe at the start of his recounting. So yes, I mean, because it was this illusory stature, this inflated egotism, this sense, you could almost call it hubristic pride. And what I mean by that is that you're inherently good. It's not based really on your actions. Whatever emanates from you is going to be good. And so he had this oneness with himself, and that's his Edenic state. It's almost before self-consciousness, just like the biblical fall. So I think we would both agree that that's where he started. The next thing is, what's the nature of that transition from higher to lower, in terms of height, but in terms of obviously his perspective on his moral stature. What was your view on that shift, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way it is depicted, because there's a series of incidents that he recounts. I've mentioned the woman drowning in the river where he doesn't help her, and he mentions another incident where he's involved in an altercation outside of his car, where he's made to look foolish in front of all. There's a traffic jam, I think, and he gets out and he's thinking about fighting with somebody, and then he gets punched unawares and just essentially is laughed at. And again, this seems to really have struck him as well. So it's like these series of incidents over a period of years, I guess, in the novel, it suggests just made him start to have this experience of self-doubt and self-awareness. Now, as you said, it's a tricky one, because I would agree with you. He seems like such a sharp, savvy character. It does seem a little bit unlikely in a way that the way he constructs this narrative of absolute obliviousness in Eden to absolute, self-hate doesn't seem to quite fit for somebody as savvy as he is. But then, of course, as the novel progresses, we realise everything he's said has been a constructed narrative to try to have an effect on the person that he's talking to. So again, we don't actually know what we can and can't believe. So in terms of how this transition from innocence to fall played out for him, I mean, we can only, if we take at face value what he says, that would seem to be the process. This realizing that he isn't admired by everybody. Sometimes he's laughed at. Sometimes he does well. Pretty much all the time he does things to look good rather than to actually be good. So this dawning awareness seemed to be the thing that shattered his faith in himself, and therefore shattered his faith in life, I guess. That's kind of how I would see the transition, as best we can make sense of it.
I would agree with you that there is that question of how sincere it is, or how it might be overly symmetrical, the narrative, in the sense that the shift is so stark, so profound, Like it's an inversion, isn't it, as you say, from innocence to experience.
Yes.
But I think what we're dealing with here actually is what could be called experience as a profound cynic would see it, because what we see is this initial professing that he and virtue were one, in essence, and then realizing, allegedly, that all his moral actions were driven by vanity and lust for power. So the shift from higher to lower is, in a sense, from believing at one point in higher motivations, in fact, seeing that he could not be motivated by anything but that, to lower, baser emotions. And much of the novel is him trying to argue through anecdotes and maxims that really human beings are just motivated by baser motivations. What we're talking about is vanity, lust, desire to dominate. He gives plenty of examples that seem to, in his mind, corroborate that that's really what's going on. So the fall is a fall from, believing in higher motivations to this profound cynicism where it's essentially that we're all motivated by baser things. That was what I took away from it in terms of that fall.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a key point here, really, is that he is such a strange character in that sense, because he as he depicts himself, this absolute sense of narcissism and also obliviousness. If it was the case, as he professes, that he simply almost had no non-egotistical motives prior to this kind of fall, he simply, that was what he did. He pursued his own interest and virtually nothing else. Then obviously that kind of, he seems to be assuming that everybody's like that deep down, and that's essentially the cynicism, whereby he now knows that's what was going on with him, and he sees that in himself. But it's like self-awareness without really the capacity for any moral improvement. Whereas, I mean, I think it would seem to be kind of more commonsensical to think that not everybody would initially, in an innocent state, have that level of absolute narcissism, kind of unadulterated self-interest. So therefore, this kind of trajectory of innocence to cynicism wouldn't be the path you would assume people would take in such a black and white way if they were to, say, become a bit more self-aware about when they've been egotistical and when they've been narcissistic and so on. So yeah,
Absolutely.
it's like it's like he's gone on a very extreme journey, but again, in either case, to me, what he doesn't really seem to be able to do is kind of more grow as a person. It's just this sense of a naive narcissism to more cynical self-interest.
Yes,
that's the journey.
Well, I mean, that I would agree with you on that, and this leads us on to that third part. But before we move on to that, I just want to say one thing, is that I think that he does, through this journey, or alleged journey, he does acknowledge, a real moral insight, which is that the ego can wear 1,000 masks, and one of the ways that it can manifest itself is through morality. That the ego can be ambitious through morals. It can corrupt our morals, and yet it can seem as though we are being moral. And that is a genuine, realistic moral insight. The only thing is that he totalizes it, he generalizes it, he actually corrupts that moral insight by his profound cynicism.
Yes, that is a good point.
But I was going to, in terms of that lack of growth that you intimated, I think this is leads on to, what was the injury and how did he recuperate? And as we've both intimated, it was a narcissistic injury, that this profound shift in his self-conception, going from seeing himself at one with virtue to thinking that he is irredeemably bad, and there's no potential for growth there. But what he does, which I think is really interesting, is that he, rather than see it as an opportunity to grow, to develop as a person, he wants a vindictive triumph. So it's like his ego still wins out. And when I say a vindictive triumph, he feels tremendously abased by his moral standing. And he thinks to himself, how can I address this? How can I elevate myself again? And the way in which he does it is that he becomes a judge. As he actually lays out his strategy, that how he appeases his own self-condemnation, his own guilt, is to accuse everyone else too. So, he himself is not too bad if everyone else is just as bad. But where he is elevated is that he has the discernment, the experience to know this, and then he can be judge of his fellow men. So he achieves another kind of pseudo-elevation in this novel.
Yes, exactly. So that's interesting, isn't it? That there's a fall, but then there's a kind of rise again.
Yes.
And at least in terms of his kind of ego defense, I suppose you could say. But yeah, I quite agree with you as you described it there. He finds a pseudo solution really to this sudden awareness of his own hypocrisy, I guess you could say. But again, it's so bound up in others in the sense of being above them, and it's now a different way in which he can be above them by this virtue of having this awareness and being the preeminent judge of immorality everywhere, that he somehow gets this sense of victory, or as you said, vindictive triumph even. So yeah, it's quite a dark and I guess unconvincing solution that he comes up with, But I mean, again, this is obviously the character. It's not to talk down the interesting and kind of uncomfortable issues that the novel does raise actually for the reader, because it's, he's obviously a particularly extreme case, Clemens, but there's also something that he's saying that we can all kind of take heed of in ourselves, I think.
When you think about the relationship between the narrative form and the themes, the dramatic monologue, the interlocutor and things like that, because that's probably something we should touch on too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a good, yeah, to me, it's quite a dazzling, hypnotic style. It's powerful. It's also quite excruciating and claustrophobic as well, I find. It's an interesting mixture. He comes out with these beautiful phrases, so you are quite wowed by him, but as it goes on, it's painful because it's this sense of this person who just is so trapped in themselves that they, there's nothing comes back. It's like he's trapped in this monologuing world. And yeah, in terms of the themes, well, I mean, the novel. I mean, it's not a cheerful novel. It's looking at themes like hypocrisy and the sense of exile and futility, and it really does brilliantly convey this lost soul who is lost in himself first and foremost, and he's kind of there's almost this sort of strange delight he's taken in having exiled himself to a place that he perceives as like hell on earth. He makes all these allusions to the inner circles of hell and the Amsterdam canal networks, and quite a sort of somber view of the location that he's reveling in a way. But again, all of this seems quite detached and lonely. It's not really an image or an experience that he's capable of sharing. Although he's narrating it, he can't really connect to anybody else. He's so lost in himself. So yeah, I think the narrative form was perfect actually to convey that kind of person. I thought it was beautifully done.
I think that's a really good point, that the monologue form is a sort of symptom of how, while he's communicating in one sense, he's also trapped in his own perspective. I mean, one good thing, one way of comparing it would be to, say, a Socratic dialogue, an actual dialogue where you test and you might change your opinions. What we see here is that the dramatic monologue is a sign of an isolation created by the certainty that he has. His perspective is so certain and so definite and so absolutist that you can't really engage in that through dialogue. I know that he's sharing it with an interlocutor, but it shows or it betrays that absolutism and that isolation, unlike, say, a Socratic dialogue where you're open to or have to defend your view. Here he doesn't really have to. The interlocutor is more listening, just as the reader is too. And I think the interlocutor just being schematically depicted allows them to stand in for us. So it's like we're looking over the interlocutor's shoulder as Clemens is talking to this interlocutor. I think it's, and this interlocutor doesn't say too much. I mean, very occasionally makes some remark. And, again, if he was saying something very definite, then that would act as a sort of barrier between us and Clemens. The fact that interlocutor doesn't really say his opinions much means that then we're freer to interpret and construct our own. I think also the interlocutor being rather quiet very subtly suggests that we might approach this with some critical detachment, because there's a few points in the novel where Clemens tries to get an answer from his interlocutor and he doesn't get one. The suggestion that this interlocutor doesn't fully confide or trust in him or is wary, I think that might be a subtle way of conveying to the reader that we should also be wary and a bit detached, that we shouldn't get too seduced by this very eloquent speaker.
Yeah, great points. Absolutely. I think that is what's so clever about it. Really, it is hard to quite find a definite take on Clemens. He's dazzling. It's almost like a seduction, of his verbal brilliance. But at the same time, there is deliberate insertions of distance that do make us take stock of him. So I certainly think that both of those things are what Camus was intending for us to do in making sense of Clemens.
If his perspective is distorted, as I think we both believe it is, what role do you think an excessive self-consciousness played in that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think he's, from what we've been piecing together here, Alex, it's quite a unique kind of fall, really, that he's depicted there, although he does seem to be wanting to make the case for it being a kind of universal experience. It maybe is to some extent, but yeah, I think the self-consciousness is absolutely key. The fact that he recounts his pleasures prior to his fall, they were all so egocentric. And even when he began to fall, I guess, he fell into more kind of debauchery, as he describes it, drunkenness, lust, and all these things. And I think what's distinctly lacking in all of this at any point, actually, is that he didn't seek to really connect with anybody. There was no solution to him in any kind of more authentic communication, I guess, because all he really seems to have known is this kind of narcissistic sense of comparing himself to others and coming up on top. It just doesn't seem to occur to him to actually more try to communicate as an equal. And I think that's this extreme self-consciousness that and I guess self-fixation. And it's interesting, of course, that he opts for exile. It's obviously. You alluded earlier to the fact that people do sometimes through shame want to retreat, and of course he has retreated, and he recounts some of these affairs he had, the drunken behaviour, the sabotage in his career. So he doesn't say that maybe his exile actually was also just to avoid facing up to the consequences, to the sense of being seen as a failure by others in Paris that he might have known. I'm not sure, but yeah,
I think you're right.
But yeah, self-consciousness. I think that's it. He has the door locked really on any kind of communication. He's absolutely in it. He's built himself a kind of ego castle, and he's trapped in it. And it's both his sense of kind of narcissistic kick, but also despair. I would say.
I think that's a good point. That the exile and moving away from Parisian society would be a sign of him feeling he can no longer live up to that, he can no longer be that actor as he once was, that had unravelled, and various things that he'd done as well harmed his reputation, which would probably be connected to shame. And of course, self-consciousness is connected to shame. I think that, this excessive self-consciousness that he had, if we see it from a mental health perspective, that usually when we do get our consciousness is divided in this way, and it's turned back upon itself, and so it's like our own thoughts and feelings become the intentional object of our consciousness, that usually that puts us in quite a critical mood. I remember the psychoanalyst Theodor Reich saying that, most of the time we're like someone that looks outside the window and, is quite unaware of the room that we're in. But when something happens in that room, we start to turn within and look in this darkened room. And he says that's like how it is with our psyches. So in other words, it's this general idea that most of the time our consciousness is rather directed outward with things that we're engaged in. But when it's turned within, usually it's because we've perceived some kind of problem. We're in some kind of critical mood, particularly the inner critic gets us looking back within ourselves. So what I'm saying is, if we're inhabiting this state of constant introspection, it's probably going to do quite a bit of harm to our mental health, because we'll be not only aware of more troubling things perhaps, but also seeing it bathed in this critical light as well. So I think that's one of the problems there with self-consciousness, I would say.
Yes. It's a really interesting way to describe it there. And of course, with Clemens, as we've been discussing, as you said, he's this looking out at the world, but for him, he's always looking out to see how the world's looking back at him. So
yes.
I guess he can never stop introspecting in that way, because he's so caught up in that. So yeah, I can imagine there would be something torturous actually about never being able to actually lose himself in a conversation or in an activity, when there's always this one, this part of his mind that's keeping tuned into this sense of how am I looking, am I dominating, am I strong here? It does. It
would be a form of entrapment. I mean, this is something that Viktor Frankl, the logotherapist, talked about. He had a technique called dereflection. And this was meant to be an antidote to excessive self-consciousness. So, for Frankl, meaning and purpose is by directing our attention, our consciousness to things outwardly that can ground us, can give us meaning and purpose. So dereflection would be losing that sense of self through some kind of absorbing activity where we can exist in a state of flow, which is very different to that heightened self-consciousness state where our flaws become bloated through that heightened attention, whereas dereflection grounds us in an external purpose. And it takes us away from that heightened self-consciousness, which, leads to anxiety and depression and rumination, which is no doubt what Clemens was suffering from in many ways.
Well, indeed. I mean, this sort of anti-Socratic conversation that he's involved in, it's the ultimate failure to achieve that, the flow state that would come from actually being engaged in an interesting discussion. But as we alluded to earlier, because it's so one-directional, there's nothing can come back. But yet it's all coming from him, but it's all about him. I mean, it is. It's that kind of sense of somebody who's enjoying himself in an egotistical way, but in a very unfulfilling way that will have a kind of bitter aftertaste actually for him.
Yes,
It's not really, it could never be joyous, that however much it's kind of ego stroking in that moment.
No, well, I mean, when we're happy, when we're absorbed in what we're doing, we're not self-conscious. And one of the interesting pieces of research is that when they've studied correspondence by people that have committed suicide, they found more use of the first person pronoun, I, in their correspondence, that they use it more. So it's this idea that they've got this heightened self-consciousness. So that shows you how pernicious it could be.
Well, indeed. Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the subject of suicide because, as we alluded to, obviously this is something that Clemens, he essentially alludes to the fact he has thought about this. So he has been suicidal, clearly, and he's obviously, again, recounting his kind of toying with the notion. But one thing I read that I thought was interesting on that subject by Karen Horney, who obviously will be covering one of her books later in the series, and I'm a fan of her work. She talks about the fact that suicide, when it's driven by a kind of neurotic vindictiveness, it could be a kind of peculiar scenario whereby the person attempting or committing suicide might, in a sense, almost be expecting to be there to witness the reaction of those who discover them. And she says that no one would be more surprised than the suiciding individual to actually find themselves dead. Now, I'm not obviously suggesting that applies to all cases of suicide, of course not, but in this kind of scenario, from what you're describing, it does seem to me that does kind of fit with Clemens. Even in something as dramatic as suicide to end his troubles, it's only worthwhile if he can, in a way, be there to enjoy the reaction in some sense, as if a kind of ghost.
I mean, you're right. You're right that we can't say that all about with every person that feels suicidal.
Oh no,
committed suicide, but we can say that it would be a subsection, as we see with Clemens, that he had entertained those thoughts of suicide just to see how these friends would behave. But then it seems that he was spared from committing suicide because he didn't think it would have the intended effect on them. So it would be again a kind of, he was hoping for it to be a sort of vindictive triumph that he would finally. They would finally recognise how important he was to them. And it was because he didn't believe that they would react that way that, it lost its appeal.
So how do we avoid the cynicism trap then? How do we protect ourselves from getting kind of stuck in that really, kind of grim cynicism about others?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, just like when I was talking about shame, it might be a good thing just to say, well, what is cynicism really? And we've talked a little bit about earlier on this idea that so-called higher motivations are really baser motivations. So it's a kind of inverting, what we think we were motivated by. It's a form of unmasking, or at least it seemed to, cynics like to see it that way, that they've took off the mask and shown the real face. The problem about cynicism is that, it's a bit like sentimentality. It's an excessive emotional reaction. It's a kind of emotional incontinence, really, because we become too credulous of our suspicions. We think if we're profoundly cynical, we think that our suspicions are the only thing that we can trust, and our suspicions are the only thing that is true. We don't recognise that there are times where we have to be suspicious of our suspicions. We can't always trust our suspicions, but the cynic, who is actually profoundly motivated by fear, they prefer to trust their suspicions because they think, well, at least I'll be safe. So it's not going to be to use that lingo, a growth mindset if we're profoundly cynical, because for one thing, there is this great definiteness, profound conviction that they're right. I mean, you could say that cynicism is a kind of epistemic arrogance, the idea that you know for sure what motivates people, and it's always these base set of motivations. And of course, so it's not a very discerning or and judicious view of people. It doesn't say that, well, it's possible that person X in situation Y might behave in a moral way, and we've got to learn to work out when they are motivated by something more moral and by something perhaps more base. It doesn't do discrimination. So that's why it's really seductive for people, because you don't really have to think. In terms of tackling it, I think that The Fall gives us a bit of an idea here, because Clemens uses, he uses a lot of maxims, a lot of witticisms, a lot of maxims that encapsulate, in his view, how humans really are, and that exposes the overgeneralizing tendency of cynicism, the idea that things can be just reduced to, these base, materialistic motivations. So when tackling it, I think what we're looking at is being very careful about not overgeneralizing about people. It is possible to be morally pessimistic about the human race, the idea that it is very hard for us to do the right thing. And sometimes we don't even know what is the right thing. But even when we do, it can still be very hard. We are morally frail. But what we have to recognize is that when we're dealing with a particular human being in a particular context, we can't necessarily and inevitably assume that our cynicism, if we have it, is going to apply there. So it's recognizing that the individual people might not be encapsulated by more cynical or pessimistic views of humanity. I think that's one of the main ways of tackling it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it obviously relies on a lot of parodying. To me, it's very closely connected to this keeping himself at a distance. You obviously, as you described there, there's a fear actually fueling this. That such individuals, they're not actually quite willing to meet others on equal terms or be open. Open themselves up to. They cling to this suspicion, as you said. Like for example, in the Folly, in the start, as you recall, in the bar scene, he describes the barman as a Cro-Magnon man. A caveman, and so there's this kind of strange kind of jump into a kind of contemptuous depiction, but then he goes on to actually suggest he actually somewhat likes the barman as well. It's a very strange kind of mindset, but again, there's just this need to kind of rely on a sort of bottom line, what's this person all about, and reduce them to whatever it may be. So I think that was an interesting analysis you gave of that issue there.
I would say when it came to the barman that actually his attitude makes sense from a cynical point of view, that yes, he sees him as a caveman, but he could actually like him because really represents what we fundamentally are, that sort of uncouth base reality, and it's just more transparent with the barman.
I guess that's true. I mean, I suppose Clemens has deliberately only frequents, he frequents these red light district bars. There's this kind of, draw towards places where he's more likely to encounter, I guess, people that fit into his cynical scheme about human life. He's not going anywhere that's going to challenge that viewpoint, actually. So yeah, as you say, the barman is perhaps, if he's been depicted fairly here, a bit brutish or money-oriented or aggressive, or whatever else may be behind that. But yeah, I think I guess there's a maybe an unconscious aversion to encountering anything in life that's going to challenge that, parody view that he's holding on to here, just because if of course, as soon as he does, then his, desire to be the judge, becomes undermined. If he's not quite so able to just sum people up in this kind of cynical little sketch kind of way.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Because the cynic believes that how they see the world is the way it is. They think that their judgment is unerring. As I say, there's this arrogance to it. And there's no need to rectify, amend, or make more nuanced your perspective if you're an outright cynic. Yeah, and you're comforted if you can find some base motivation in what people do. You see it as, well, that's what they're all about. And of course, the more declarative someone is, the more the cynic will be at home with that in a kind of strange way, perverse way.
Yeah, I get. Yeah, indeed. Whereas, of course, the real terror maybe for the cynic is actually laying themselves bare. In terms of being open, not maybe quite in the way that Clemence is. In terms of this kind of controlled revelation of his vices, but with this kind of underlying objective. But actually, a more, I suppose, a less constructed narrative in his way of communicating, and more of just an honest, talk about how he's feeling, talk about what he's thinking. I suppose it's that sense of communicating in an unrehearsed, open way that this a cynic like Clemence is so desperately trying to avoid. I guess because
Absolutely.
of the vulnerability involved in actually that kind of openness.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you refer to vulnerability, because there is this famous work called The Critique of Cynical Reason, which is a reworking of Kant's famous work. But in The Critique of Cynical Reason, early on, it says that cynicism is a defense against crying. So there is that intimation. It is the defense against vulnerability. The cynic doesn't want to feel real pain. They want to be protected against vulnerability. They never want to be vulnerable again, but therefore they can never really grow as people.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, interesting. So I guess this is really getting to the root of Clemence's kind of impossible dilemma, actually, that he can't grow, and of course he's so attached to his superiority, but of course he can't cry either, for all the despair, actually, he's feeling. He can't really quite feel it in that way, or certainly he can't share it, I would say.
No, he can't cry for himself. He won't give himself that pity. He doesn't think that he deserves it, or anyone does. Instead, it's this punitive judgment that he has. So yes, the cynic is trapped in that despair. But it seems it's very protective, or so it seems to them anyway.
Yeah. The final mental health issue, I guess, we're going to maybe consider here was the issue of that, the supposed integrity that he possessed prior to his fall, as he believes it. That's not really credible, for the reasons that we've covered here. So, is there this innocence that Clemence attested to? That's not what we're aspiring to here. That's not the right kind of goodness. So is there a more legitimate kind of integrity, do you think, that we really could aim for, that that would really cut through this kind of more cynical, fearful viewpoint? Yes,
somebody that is tried to achieve that more adult, that more nuanced form of integrity is not so much caught up on other people's judgments. It's not like they would be oblivious to them. They would take feedback, they would weigh it up, but what they recognise is that the good is something that needs to be worked out, and other people's opinions might help towards that, but it's not what it's fundamentally about, really. You don't need to turn other people into judges or authorities to have integrity.
Yes. It's a great point, isn't it? Particularly in the world of of all the X Factor spin-offs and all the the reality judges that there are out there who we sort of kind of hold up as the the opinion that really matters on on whatever talent it may be. I suppose certainly when it comes to moral matters, at least, in a way you could be pursuing this in the dark. It would be unfortunate if you were never, I suppose, recognised or valued by anybody for your attempts towards being a good person. But if you were unfortunate enough to be like that, that need not be the end of the world, actually. It's about really you being able to, I suppose, look yourself in the mirror and be honest about your attempts, Well,
it is. I mean, I don't think Simon Cowell, incidentally, is a judge penitent. I think he was simply a judge. I don't think there was much penitence there.
I've never seen any,
to be honest. And I don't think he would have been profoundly affected by Clemence's discoveries either. But to go back to the idea of integrity here, that I remember reading this book. I mean, it was quite a curious book, but a good book actually, which was called Emotional Equations. It was dealing with certain emotions and putting them in this kind of equation form. And for integrity, it was authenticity times invisibility times reliability. So what it was saying is that we have integrity is about doing things for because they're the right thing to do, no matter who sees it, really. So invisibility is a key thing. And so you remember that famous thought experiment from Plato, the ring of Gyges, that if you had that, you would have this invisibility. What would you do? This was, in a sense, a test of your integrity. Would you have integrity or not?
It's a great point, isn't it? I mean, it is actually the absolute opposite of what Clemence has been essentially espousing in The Fall. This idea that maybe invisibility is actually something ideal here when it comes to integrity. The absolute absence of self-consciousness, of looking for approval and looking for other people to put their thumbs up to whatever it is we may be doing. That may happen and that may be nice, but it's almost like that needs to be, I guess, removed from the equation altogether, from what you're saying, for it to be true integrity.
Well, it is, and I remember hearing this really touching anecdote that on a piece of news after John Candy had died, that they had discovered that he had donated privately to the local hospital around the area which he was filming, and that just underscored more how good a guy he was. That it was done. So it was done privately. It was done quietly. It was not announced, and that to me suggests that that act was an act of integrity from him.
Yeah, it's a nice contrast, isn't it, to the much more kind of very, very conspicuous, charitable acts that many people in the limelight choose to take part in. Of course, I mean, not to say that many others might not be doing what John Candy did. Actually,
no, of course,
we hope they are, and if they are, then I guess that's the real goodness there.
Well, it is. I mean, those great comedy writers, Galton Simpson, remember how they showed Hancock's lack of integrity, that when he goes to donate blood, he asked, do you get a badge? And so, I mean, I'm not saying that completely invalidates what he was doing, the character, but it's not what integrity is about. As I say, potential invisibility is a key aspect of it.
Yeah, and of course, because we have, as we've recognised earlier, that Clemence is right that we're all guilty at times of being more, secretly egotistical, maybe even secretly from ourselves. So it's all, I suppose, this kind of integrity that we're describing is really an ideal to aspire towards.
Yes,
it's not something if we think we've got it, and that's it, we've just achieved integrity, we're probably kidding ourselves. It's obviously got to be that ongoing battle in a way against our more self-interested and less savoury sides.
I mean, that's a good point. So, that an effort is required.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe a final note for us to end on today, Alex, then would be thinking about the issue of, so what do we think has been the impact on our own lives of rereading this interesting book? What would you say?
Well, I was thinking about that, and you know how at the start of our conversation I said that, you know, when I was in my early 20s, this book could seem, you know, greatly compelling, Clemence's perspective. I wasn't seeing all the nuances or how Camus himself might be getting us to, in subtle ways, doubt the character's tale. But reading it now, I think the main reason why I don't buy into that perspective nearly as much is it's got a lot to do with the work that I do, because, you know, I sit down practically on a daily basis hearing people's private thoughts, their confessions, and the idea of humanity that I get from that in these secret confidential moments is nowhere near as bleak. It's more optimistic than what Clemence had ever depicted, which gets me thinking that the character probably had few people ever confide in him, because if you have people confide in you, as I do on a regular basis, that you can see that there is genuine guilt, there's contrition, there is all kinds of soft and loving feelings that might not get directly expressed. We mustn't think that the private or the hidden is the Mr. Hyde. It's nowhere near as simple as that. One of the saddest facts of life is that some of the nicest things that we could say about someone end up in their eulogy and might have gone unsaid when they were alive. So what I'm saying is that, yes, as I think about how it relates to my life now, I think that doing my counselling work has gave me more faith in people. I could see beyond what Clemence had said. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful for that, and I can understand even more now why Carl Rogers, a famous therapist, said that when he thought about society, he was pessimistic, and when he thought about individuals, he was optimistic. I think therapy work can help in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's that. Yeah, that's really nice. I think. I mean, obviously, I'm not a therapist, but I quite agree with you that, you know, from a maybe slightly more mature perspective, these kind of really cynical sentiments do just seem to not ring true. I think it really comes down to that. And again, of course, Camus himself probably wasn't wanting us to simply just swallow everything Clemence said. I think it was much more complex than that. But yeah, I think if anyone was kind of tending that way, then yeah, they are maybe they are undoubtedly missing something. I think I think that people are not anything like the kind of hypocritical creatures, obviously, that Clemence wants to paint.
No.
So that's interesting. Yeah, my takeaway from this one, Alex, was it made me I was struck by these incidents that had obviously troubled Clemence. That he sort of built into this narrative, and it kind of made me think that probably, I guess maybe we all, or I don't know, are inclined sometimes to cling to incidents. These kind of cringe moments where we've maybe looked bad or we've looked silly, and there's something slightly unfortunate about our ability to maybe sometimes remember more of the times where we've looked bad than maybe the times where we've simply done good, regardless of how it did or didn't look. So to me, it made me, my takeaway, I think, was just it made me think that when these incidents do come into my head about a time when I've maybe looked silly, that that isn't actually something that's really worth the time and energy to cling to, because it's not really a moral issue, is it? I guess it's simply just, you looked bad. We look silly sometimes.
Absolutely. It's not as revelatory as what we might think. I mean, Ricky Gervais has made a career out of those kind of cringe-worthy moments and stuff. How we can be affected by it. But again, it also goes back to the issue of shame, doesn't it? Too.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, if obviously, there's not a lot of place for that kind of shame. I wouldn't have thought if we're trying to be, pursuing something that's more towards integrity, as we described. So these. I think we can cut ourselves some slack that we'll all have this catalogue of times we've looked silly, but that's okay. We can just leave that catalogue on the shelf. It's not really worth opening it up and subjecting ourselves mentally again to these cringe moments. Where we're going to get it wrong sometimes. We're going to look silly, and that's the creatures that we are, I guess.
It could be part of being human.
Yeah,
I mean, we're not.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the reasons why we love drama is that characters might know the right thing to say in the right situation at the right time, but it's quite rare in life for people to be as articulate as that. And so, we are at times fumbling through things, and that's a more compassionate take on ourselves than this idea of having to be perfect. We are going to say silly things or stumble on our words and so on.
I was thinking about my, more of a literal stumble when I, in the 3 seconds on the DVD of my graduation when I crossed the stage, I managed to step on my gown and stumble. Of course, caught for posterity, but. Quite frankly, people that know me know that I bump into things quite regularly. It's just, we can't always look like smooth operators, and we don't really need to, I guess.
But that stumble didn't instigate a fall, didn't it?
Well, I hope not.
No.
There was no exile, was it?
There was no exile.
There was nothing like
way.
that.
But I'll know what will happen if you don't turn up for the next podcast.
It's really hit me hard.
You've gone in exile, yeah.